So welcome to our second D&I session in our series Equality at Work, How Structure Matters. And today we really are happy to talk about mental health in the workplace. This is the topic of today. And my name is Patricia Widmer. And I am the Program Director for Diversity and Management Programs at the University of St. Gallen. I've been with the university for about 6.5 years, always in the intersection of diversity and management. I have a business administration background and also background in banking and finance. And my dissertation was about gender disparity at the top of companies. So the whole topic around diversity and inclusion is very dear to my heart and something that is, accompanying me on a daily basis, and really passionate about this. That's why I'm really looking forward to be able to talk to a great expert today. But before I'm going to hand over to our expert of this session, we want to give you some technical information. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat. Just write your questions in the chat and we will be happy to answer them at the end of the session. You can also raise your hand. You can use that function. And then in the end, we will call you so you can actually ask your question. Or in the Q&A session at the end, you can definitely also just unmute yourself and ask your question as well. So there are these three functions. Feel free. We are happy to answer your questions at the end during the Q&A. And now it's really a pleasure to welcome Dr. Nicole Kalindaga from PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, for today's session. And Nicole, I'm happy to hand over to you for a short introduction of yourself.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Yes, hi everyone. I am happy to be here today. As mentioned, I'm Nicole. I'm working at PwC Switzerland. And there I'm a culture and change manager and well-being lead. Culture and change, that means I'm involved in a lot of topics. I'm part of the diversity and inclusion team. I'm dealing with topics such as flexible working, culture as mentioned before, but also employee empowerment and engagement. I have a background in psychology, and I also did a PhD in organizational and work psychology. And yeah, I'm very happy to talk about mental health and its effect for an inclusive work environment.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nicole, for your introduction. And I would like to start and just, lay the foundation a little bit. What are we talking about, right? I mean, when we see and look back for the last year, the disruption of the pandemic really provided an opportunity to rethink management practices and use advances also in brain science, especially to offer innovative solutions to promote employees' well-being and mental health. And I would also give you some insights about a study that has been made in Canada, which provides evidence that workplace mental health programs are an investment that actually yields the valuable returns rather than the cost. And having said that, we really want to go into the following questions for today's session. So what do we actually mean when we talk about well-being? And what are the consequences from a business perspective when your employees don't feel well? And what do we mean when we actually say we don't feel well? And how was the topic changed? How has it really changed in the last year specifically? So my first question to you, Nicole, is why and how is the well-being program anchored in your diversity and inclusion strategy?
That's a very good question. I have to go a bit back to give you the answer to this question. So basically, our well-being program at PwC is called Be Well, Work Well. And there was a global initiative, so from PwC Global, who rolled out this initiative and gave the different territories kind of the request to roll it out in their country. But then in the end of the day, we could decide ourselves on how we're going to do that, because it's really depending on the culture we have, on where we lay a focus on, how advanced we are already with well-being, on where to start, and so on. So for Switzerland, we embedded it into the inclusion and diversity strategy, also because one pillar we focus on within D&I is flexibility. And we believe that flexibility is actually the greatest enabler of well-being. So there's a lot of different connections to a lot of flexibility topic. For example, also when you become a parent and your flexibility becomes more important because it has a direct influence on your well-being and so on. Then also, while being a part of inclusion diversity, well-being has also been made a strategic priority by our CEO. And that also gives the initiative a different standing and a different awareness also from a leadership perspective. So we are looking at it from kind of two different ways. Now, in the end of the day, well-being for us at PwC is defined in 4 dimensions. And to explain that a little bit better, we also brought a slide. So we define well-being as a physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual dimension, energy dimension. So basically, just to give you a little bit of background, physical is the fundament of a lot of things we are doing. You can imagine it like when you have a broken leg, you're kind of limited body-wise. You can still work, but it affects your concentration, your emotions. You're just a little bit different. It affects you. So everything physical is the fundament. So we have to make sure that we are doing well physical. We are having movement, we are eating right, we have a good amount of sleep and recovery. Now, the mental dimension, the mental energy is about our cognitive capabilities. How good can we make decisions? Can we focus? Are we multitasking? How can we manage our time? This also has a big influence on how we are feeling and how well we are. Emotional energy is about the lens through which we have a look at the world. And I'm pretty sure you know that, like a day you're emotionally very positive, you see everything very different from when you're having a bad day, and you might interpret certain situations a little differently. And the last dimension, spiritually, has actually nothing to do with religion, even though it sounds a little bit like it, but it's kind of the purpose and the values we are standing for. So yeah, that's it on the dimensions. We are driving well-being at PwC, and we also have offerings within these 4 dimensions, and we are basically bringing up new offerings also based on employee feedback. Now, my question to you, Patricia, is actually, do you see a trend of one of the dimensions becoming more relevant these days?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Thank you so much, Nicole, for giving the overview. When I look into especially also the research being done and what we found when we are talking to different organizations, I think everything around well-being and mental health in general, and I think at the end of the day, it really covers all dimensions that you just mentioned, are super important. However, what we see, and that's maybe also a bit critical in a way, still only a few companies, are really taking this seriously. It's becoming more and more important. We see that. But still, we feel that some companies haven't really set the focus specifically on well-being and mental health. They're maybe still quite stuck in certain topics they are talking about also in leadership development. But we see the coronavirus pandemic and the resulting economic downturn have actually taken a toll on mental health for many, many people. There is a study in the USA made that shows with over 30% of adults in the USA, they're now reporting symptoms of consistent anxiety and or depressive disorder. And I think that is something that we really have to keep in mind. And this brings me actually also to an interactive part here with you, with the audience, because I would like to ask the first question to you. We're going to do a short poll, because I said a lot of the companies have not really focused yet. So my question to you is, Is your company committed to the well-being of its employees? And I'm really curious what you're going to answer. Is it yes, my company has taken measures last year, or not directly, but there are own resources that are supported, or although it is not on the agenda in your company, there is progress, but not at all. The company is actually not really taking this seriously. Take your time, and we're soon going to see the results coming in. I'm looking forward to results. They will be shown on the screen as well. We will see if your companies are actually among the pioneers and leaders here. And this is a great answer. And I mean, now we're almost kind of, preaching to the choir, because obviously you all work for companies that are actually quite advanced in this topic. So your companies, they have taken measures last year, which is amazing. Nevertheless, we cannot forget, a few of you also mentioned that there were not really measures being taken, or even though it's on the agenda, it has not really progressed yet. So maybe we can give you some insights today in our session, how you can maybe approach it. And for the others, where the companies are already quite advanced, maybe you can get some new insights from our discussion today. So I think the window of the poll should have been disappeared now. If not, you can close it yourself. And I would like to go on based on that poll, Nicole. What was then the key driver at PwC that started the project Be Well, Work Well? Because obviously, I'm pretty sure when you cast your vote, you clicked the first answer.
Yeah, I did. And I'm also super happy that I saw so many results that are in the same way. So I guess for PwC, I can mention two things. There are kind of two sides on a medal. It's a mix of kind of internal and external needs, I would say. I'm starting with external. I guess one reason for a lot of companies is definitely to attract talent. And to attract talent, you have to do your research and figure out what is important for people who are applying to your company. And I have also seen a trend that the needs are changing, and there is a higher request that well-being is actually made a topic within a company. And it's important for people to have a proper balance and feel well. So companies need to invest if they want to stay competitive. Now, the other factor that is especially important also to me and my role is actually the need and the feedback from our employees themselves. And when Work Well was started, PwC US actually did a huge study where they questioned all the employees on what a well-being means to them and what they need as employees in regard to strengthen and support their well-being. And the result from this study was actually the 4 dimensions that came out, and how we approached also well-being within the company. So we really asked the employees by collecting data, what do you want, what do you need? And that was the kickoff for the rollout of Be Well, Work Well also globally.
I'm still on mute. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Nicole, for giving us this insight and also the 2 perspectives here, right? Because I think it's very important to see them, because obviously there are a lot of different aspects that play a role here. And I do know that at PwC, you actually chose to collaborate with a scientific partner to actually approach the topic of well-being. Maybe you can give us a little bit of insights why you chose this approach.
Sure. So as stated before, we started kind of scientifically by collecting data, and PwC also works regularly with scientific partners. And during COVID, we had a collaboration where we also surveyed our people voluntarily over 11 weeks. because we wanted to know how their well-being is during the home office times, and also find out how they want to work in the future when we approach our new normal. And there the choice was to collaborate, to do it scientifically as we have done it in the past. And I mean, the benefit definitely is to have an independent partner collecting the data. And I guess one point I don't need to mention is how you collect data has a huge influence on what kind of data you're getting in the end. I mean, the measurement is most important. So we wanted to be credible in the way we are doing it and having a strong partner with us. And we also wanted to do it transparently. So informing people ongoingly what we are collecting and what we are doing with the data. This also ensures kind of a long-term sustainability. And in the end of the day, the results, they were discussed in many leadership meetings, and it's still ongoing because we have a huge amount of data actually from this 11 weeks and over 1,000 people or employees participated in the study. And the results were also made available to our employees. As I said, we wanted to be transparent, but we also wanted to foster trust so that they directly see what is the output and what is being done with the data. So I was also wondering, Patricia, from your experience, does a scientific approach increase trust? Do you agree with me what I just said?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the university, we do a lot of research about trust in the workplace, also from an HR perspective. And we see often also in our collaborations with different organizations that trust also promotes sustainability and sustainable efforts, you know, all kinds of different efforts in the workplace. And there was actually an interesting result that we found from a study, especially when we were looking at the remote working setup. Because if you do not actually go into a scientific approach and you just listen to what people are saying and just from a surface level discussion, you would almost think that everybody loved the work from home, you know, everybody was happy about the flexibility. And especially when you talk to leaders, they said, oh, it's amazing, it's working so well, people are doing great and better than we expected. But from our study, we saw that this was really a perception that especially the leaders had. So the study showed that especially leaders were very happy with the remote work. They thought, oh, it goes actually really well to lead the team, to actually guiding everybody and bringing everybody together and driving efforts forward. However, it was really interesting to see that especially the team members and the employees were actually not as happy with the setup eventually. They were quite exhausted and they thought this setup is quite burdensome. So when we looked into the data, we really saw this differentiation between the leaders and the team members. And I think that's why it's really important to go deep, looking at the data and really trying to find out what is behind the whole, you know, notion in the public society. And it can actually lead to trust so that we also take the employees seriously. So maybe you can share with us, Nicole, some findings from the study that you have done, you know, with this scientific approach.
Sure. I mean, we had a ton of data. So there were a lot of things to analyze. I can just mention kind of 3 findings that stood out for me. And one thing is actually very close to what you just mentioned. So we also had a question where we looked at emotions of the employees and we compared kind of more our juniors versus our leaderships. And also there, we found that actually the juniors had more negative emotion. I mean, it sounds a bit harsh, negative, but it was in the end of the day, just they struggled more with the situation. That was one finding. Another one was that employees were asking for a flexible model for the future. They were telling us that the flexibility they have right now helps their well-being, and they wanted us to invest more in in flexibility and continue to have a hybrid flexible model in the future. And last but not least, there were a lot of findings as inputs for leadership on what we should work on with our leaders. And one of them was leading with compassion. So meaning also training our leaders on the topic of mental health and making or raising awareness on this topic and making sure this is also a leadership topic. And yeah, that also then led to further initiatives we had at PwC, for example, training our people on the topic of mental health.
That's very interesting that you also implemented certain trainings. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that. What kind of trainings were you establishing, and maybe you can give us some insights about the content and the outcome of such trainings?
Sure. So we started kind of with a big wave in December, January, where we rolled out a lot of mental health trainings together with ENSA. So we also had a partner here. What we did is we offered 2 trainings to our employees. One training was specifically for employees without a leadership function. And the second training was exclusively for leadership, so line managers and coaches. And we separated them on purpose because we knew that the topics are going to be a little bit different for these 2 populations. And the topics we trained were basically about recognizing signs and signals of potential mental health problems, how to approach them, how to see them, how to have a conversation about it. So it's about breaking stigma in the end of the day as well. And for the employees without leadership function, it was also about self-care and how to take care of yourself, but also how to have a conversation with others about it. And with leadership, we focused more on how to recognize signs and signals in people you lead and how to approach the topic. What is your responsibility and where does your responsibility end? Because it's also a lot of pressure to feel like you have to be responsible for these topics. So yeah, from a D&I perspective, what do you think? What role do line managers play regarding well-being, and what impact do they have or can they have?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thanks, Nicole, also for elaborating on the trainings. And I think the leaders really have a huge responsibility here, especially because when employees feel comfortable asking for help or also sharing suggestions, even just informally, or maybe challenging the status quo without fear or without any negative social consequences, actually then organizations are more likely to innovate quickly. They actually unlock the benefits of diversity, and they can adapt very well and fast to change. So leaders actually, in my opinion, need to demonstrate the positive behaviors that can instill this climate, this positive climate. And this positive climate, we actually call it, and also in the scientific research, the psychological safety in a workplace. And the psychological safety in the workforce, this is one of the strongest proven predictors of team effectiveness. And we can only really be ourselves and unlock really the benefits of a diverse workforce if we foster an environment of psychological safety. So psychological safety actually is an important bridge on the path from diversity to inclusion. Because what it is that it's a belief, you know, that we share as members of a team or an organization. And it's also a belief that in this team, it is safe for, I would say, an interpersonal risk-taking. And that's really important, because if you do not feel safe, you know, to kind of also stand up and speak out, it's going to be really, really hard for you also in terms of well-being, because I don't think that you feel well when you always have to, you know, not be yourself. And we also saw a study made by McKinsey together with the research. Can you please mute yourself? Or Julia, could you please mute Anna? Thank you. So the researcher Amy Edmondson found that a positive team climate is really the most important factor in psychological safety. And most likely it occurs when leaders really demonstrate this behavior that I just mentioned, which is supportive. It's a consultative behavior. And it's actually also starts to challenge their teams, you know. If the leaders really go with a good example and can be a role model, that's when everything actually falls into place and can really be this, you know, bridging the gap between diversity and inclusion. So as an organization seeks to transform from diversity to inclusion, when we talk about inclusion, we also talk about belonging. And without psychological safety, diversity doesn't automatically happen, right? It's something that is a fact, but we cannot really benefit from it automatically. And therefore, there's also this saying that, and I'm pretty sure you've seen it and you've heard it, that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being invited to dance, and belonging actually is dancing like nobody is watching, you know, so that you can really be yourself. And I think that's an environment that leaders need to foster. And that brings me to the next poll question. How safe do you feel at work? And are you accepted? Can you make mistakes and still feel, you know, taken care of and not excluded? So I'm very curious. Is it yes, I feel very comfortable and accepted, even if I make mistakes, or maybe just partly, maybe depending on what kind of situation? Or is it rather not? Do you rather be quiet and don't speak up? Or is it even that you do not feel comfortable at all when you know, speak up and say something? I'm very curious to see the results. It's not as clear as the first poll. That's very interesting. And what is also very interesting here, that we have a slight majority in the second answer, where it's only partly. So this means that even though you mentioned that your company is doing a lot in terms of well-being and mental health, but still there is a part where you might not feel comfortable speaking up or even making mistakes. So that's actually a very interesting result, because it shows that it's so important that the psychological safe environment can be fostered by leaders. And so, Nicole, back to you. When you see these results and also compared to the first poll, how do you see a link between psychological safety and well-being?
So for me, well-being is extremely individual. We saw that on the 4 dimensions before. So whatever works for me might not work for you, and everyone has different well-being needs. So that also means we have to approach the topic very individually. And that actually completely speaks for inclusion and diversity. So this is also kind of tough when you implement offerings and a program, because you can go for a large scale and offer something that works for a huge crowd, but then you might not touch on the individuality that you need to get to people's need. As I mentioned before, there's a huge link between flexibility and well-being. So flexibility also means so many different things for so many different people, and therefore directly has an effect on well-being. So that also means for us, for example, at PwC, we also started to have offerings on the individual level, and we realized that they have a bigger effect, but of course, they also need more resources when you approach the person individual. But it's a super way to go to get people and what they need. On the other hand, what you mentioned before with leadership, it is true. I guess the bottom line is also that leaders need to lead people individually based on their needs, on flexibility and well-being. That also means there needs to be a conversation what the individual needs, what is important to them. So I guess you have to approach it from a leadership perspective, but also on a team level, because your team also needs to support this individuality. And this needs a shift of awareness when it comes to how a team works together and how people are leading other people. And it needs conversations on well-being and flexibility needs, so that people feel safe and they feel like, oh, I can mention what I need in regard to flexibility and well-being. And it's not as easy. It's not as easy to speak up. We need a good trust level and a good relationship with the people we work with and with the people we work for. And it's so individual, and it's also kind of hard for leaders. I'm completely aware of it. And I won't say we are perfect at PwC, but we are trying to work on it. I think it's kind of a constant approach. You have to work on it more and more and more. So I'm also wondering, maybe in your opinion, Patricia, what can be done? So what can a company do to increase an inclusive environment?
Yeah, that's super interesting, Nicole, what you just mentioned, because I think the inclusive environment is really something that needs to be worked on, you know, and as a scientific approach, I would like to introduce a framework of inclusion. It also goes back to the question, what kind of inclusive culture do we really want? And this 2x2 framework of inclusion is really kind of focusing on two different dimensions. And the two different dimensions are uniqueness and belongingness. And so uniqueness and belongingness, they actually work together to create a feeling of inclusion. So when we look at the two dimensions, the value of uniqueness and belonging to a team or an organization, well, there are four different outcomes depending on if uniqueness is low or high, or belongingness is low or high. So the one thing that you don't want is if uniqueness and belongingness is very low. So if people do actually not feel belonged to a team organization, and also they cannot be their self, they cannot be unique as they are. That's when exclusion is happening. That's what you really want to avoid. However, maybe we also have to look at the fact that uniqueness can be very high, but belongingness is very low. That's when we actually start to differentiate. That's actually when individuals are not treated as an organizational insider in the work group, in the team, in the organization, but their unique characteristics are seen as valuable, and the team or the organization think that these characteristics are required for group and organization success. So this is really the part where the value of uniqueness is very important, but this individual is not actually feeling as an insider. The individual does not really belong to that team or organization. The other extreme is the belongingness is very high, but the uniqueness is very low. Then we talk about assimilation. This is when an individual is treated as an insider, because feels very belonged and, knows everything and is very well treated. However, when they conform, they only belong to the group when they actually conform to the organizational or dominant culture norms. So they cannot be their true self. They kind of have to downplay their uniqueness. I give you an example here. Like, for instance, what we see a lot in research is if you have a group of Swiss employees and that team hires somebody from abroad, this somebody from abroad sometimes starts to assimilate so much to the Swiss group, it becomes the better Swiss, you know? Or if you start to hire, if you think you have to have more women on the top in leadership, and you start to hire one woman in a group of men, this woman often assimilates and starts to behave and also starts to acquire certain characteristics of this group of men. And then you have this assimilation going on. So you have the belonging, but not the uniqueness. So now this brings me to the fourth aspect, the one that you really want. You really want inclusion, full inclusion, where uniqueness and belongingness is very high. Because in this framework, then the individual is treated as an insider, and at the same time is also allowed and encouraged to retain his or her uniqueness within the team and the organization. And then you can actually create this inclusive workplace and foster an inclusive culture. So uniqueness will actually provide opportunities for improved group performance, but only when a unique individual is an accepted member of the group. And also if the group values actually are the particular unique characteristics that are being accepted in this environment. So I think we really have to be careful here when we talk about inclusive cultures, that the leaders are aware of such happenings, you know, that the leaders can actually come up with an inclusive leadership. And you mentioned that before, Nicole, that your team members and employees actually asks for more flexibility with regards to the workload and the setup. And it's also true that sorting out hybrid work arrangements will require managers and leaders to really rethink and expand psychological safety, because they really need to ask themselves, how do we develop psychological safety in order to foster such an inclusive culture? And especially, how do we start and where do we start? To remain the most common questions, there is actually just no time to waste, because we need to develop a leadership style to help enhance this environment. And this brings me to a few recommendations from my side, actually, especially also going back to what you said, Nicole, regarding the trainings. We really have to go beyond the one-off training programs, and we discussed that as well. We have to deploy an at-scale system of leadership development, something where human behaviors are really easy to actually implement. And it's not something that is called kind of soft skills, but really something that we have to foster. And I think companies really need to invest in leadership development, especially in experiences for their leadership that are emotional, sensory, and also create some great like aha moments, you know, where they really see, oh, exactly, that's quite eye-opening. So these learning experiences that are immersive and engaging and can be very sustainable and really are here for the longer time. And it's just not a one-off exercise that just goes away, you know, a few weeks later. So this brings me to the end. And before I give the word to you, Nicole, for your key takeaways and closing statements, I would like to share with you just three key points, and maybe also a little bit of a summary here, what I think is really important, and we show that here on the slide. I think in order to foster such a culture, we really have to encourage and create a culture for open and direct feedback. And with that, we also have to be open towards mistakes. We really have to have a certain culture where mistakes are accepted and also have a positive connotation, so that people are not afraid to make mistakes. Of course, we agree, we cannot make the same mistake 7 times in a row, but we only learn from mistakes. So therefore, an organization can only be innovative and develop further if this culture is being fostered. Second, it's very important that we have clear meeting structures, because we also observed in meetings, and we studied that quite a bit, that meetings are usually an environment where inclusiveness sometimes falls behind and through the chairs, because it has to do with who is speaking, how long is a person speaking, and who is speaking after each other. So we have to have a clear structure and also some rules to ensure that we have a balanced speaking time. And also maybe what we also saw is if junior team members are always coming at the end, they always agree what the seniors already said. So we have to turn that around so that they feel safe to speak up and also raise their maybe challenges or critiques before the senior member already said something. And third, I think, and that's something that Nicole mentioned in the beginning, and it shows that if companies do that, they're really the front runners. Inclusion is not something that we just do somewhere in a team. It really has to be a part of the corporate strategy. And it has to be implemented in all the structures and processes in the companies. So I think with these three key takeaways, I hope you have something where you can maybe go back to your daily life and maybe implement and adjust certain low-hanging fruits and improve certain processes and structures. Having said that, I would give the word back to Nicole for your key takeaways and closing statements.
Sure, very happy to, before we can answer some questions. I really liked your takeaways. I hope I can connect mine a little bit also to yours. I want to start with something extremely obvious, because I'm getting asked a lot, like, okay, what is the golden ticket to implement mental health? Like, what can we do? What can I do as a leader? And I always say, like, what about the question, how are you? Like, it's so simple, it's so obvious, but how often do you ask it? And do you accept the normal answer to the question that is normally fine, good? Or do you go deeper? So do you really show a genuine interest for the employee? And actually asking this question in more detail, and I think it comes back to what you said before about having good conversations, and it's about communication style, is also kind of how you ask the question, kind of pointing out, hey, I have witnessed kind of that you look a little bit tired today, how are you? Or I have realized that you didn't talk in the last meeting, that's very uncommon for you, how are you? So the framing the question actually can be a ticket to so many good answers and to get to know someone on a very different level. And I personally also made the experience that normally there's such a good output when having these kind of conversations, and not just to accept the fine or the good as an answer. Connected to something you talked about, Patricia, as well, I really liked the framework you presented on uniqueness and belonging, and also kind of the role the leadership has, and it also kind of correlates with one of my takeaways. So leadership needs to walk the talk. It is such an important part because it fosters trust. It has to do with transparency. So you cannot have a strategy that tells we are doing this and this without leadership actually walking the talk. It's not being taken seriously, and it doesn't foster a culture of trust with the employees. It will be seen as cynical. So it's very important to upskill leaders and to make sure they are aware of their biases and they are leading inclusive. So this is also connecting what you mentioned before. And the last thing, what I learned is actually in the end of the day, it's all about being human. People want to be treated human, not as some kind of number, some kind of machine. as some kind of equation that no one knows. It's about knowing who you're dealing with, knowing who you're working with, feeling understood. And that has, again, to do with what we talked about before, psychological safety. So people want to be seen as an individual, and they want to be treated as this individual. It's just human nature. It's very natural. Yeah, and that's actually my closing statement for today. And I'm very curious what kind of questions we are having.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nicole. I'm checking the chat and we already have a few questions here, and I'm happy to take them. So Annette actually would like to know, and I think it goes to you, Nicole, why are the types of energies, the 4 types of energies that you presented, why are they special for inclusion and diversity?
I guess it's kind of something we answered before, Annette. So it has to do with individuality. So we are using the framework of the 4 dimensions just to define what well-being means for us. So we want to approach it very broadly, because actually when we ask people what is well-being, we are going to get a different answer from everyone because it's individual. So we are trying to structure it a little bit with the 4 dimensions, also to show people on what dimension they can be different. But in the end of the day, it just points out how different well-being is to all of us. And we are using this model to explain this to the people themselves, so that they get to know themselves. It's actually not an obvious thing. Some people don't know what their mental well-being is, what their emotional well-being is. And we are using it also to upskill our leaders to show them a well-being is super individual and you have to approach it from different dimensions. It's not just about what I eat, how much sports I do. This is kind of the basic understanding of a lot of people they have about well-being. So therefore, it has to be looked at from a very, very individual level. And we're just using this framework with these dimensions to help understand what well-being means, how individual it is, and how we need to approach it to make sure we have an inclusive environment. I hope I answered your question with that. Otherwise, let me know. Half. I actually see you in the camera. I'm happy if you want to unmute and say something.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nicole. Yes, because my question was because I think is in the question, or these 5 types of energies are important for high energy or high performance in organizations. It's not only a diversity and inclusion subject. So, but I know these 4 dimensions because I wrote, or I re-lectured the book of Wolfgang Jetter, High Energy Organization. So he also divided these cognitive elements of mentally and physically and all these types of energy factors. And I know that's very important, but it's not, but I understand it now better. That is for you the way to show or to make more clear that it's individual and it's it has to do with well-being. Yeah.
I mean, I actually completely agree with you. It's also when we talk about well-being, we talk about energy and recovery, and the balance between the 2 of them, and how much energy balance you need and how much recovery you need. And it's the dimensions we chose. And I know there are also other dimensions out there, and I think they all have a truth behind them. In the end of the day, it's kind of how we want to explain it, what works for us. And the other part you mentioned is kind of how do you combine the topic within the system. It's something we talked before. You have to embed it into processes, into the culture, into the company, and they're making also well-being part of inclusion diversity, and try to explain the framework within D&I and helps leverage why we need well-being as well. So I see it as different dimensions. So everything you said, I absolutely agree with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Nicole.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And there's another question in the chat. It goes back to the program, Nicole, that you elaborated on. And it's from Eva. She says that ENSA to me is about the standardized certified mental health first aid, like the 2 full days. So she would like to know, how was this training actually customized to the people at PwC?
It's a very good question. It's someone who definitely knows ENSA well. Yeah, this is true. So actually, they offer this mental health first aid trainings, and we had a look at them, and we realized that they don't completely fit how we want to start the topic. Especially also, it was our first approach to raise awareness on the topic. So we actually sat together with ENSA, and we had a very long conversation about what we need in our culture, what is important to us. We also looked at the outcomes of the study we did, the scientific study, and what topics we want to cover in a first awareness training. And then based on all the information, what is important to us as PwC, what covers topics we want to cover, we looked at which parts out of the mental health first aider we can implement in the training. And I mean, I've also have to be honest, this first training, and it was really the first part, was a 2.5 hour training. So we also have to be very selective on what parts we are picking out. But it was important to us that it fits our culture, it fits our leadership style, and it fits what our employees need kind of in a first step. This is not the final step. We are continuing our collaboration with ENSA. So we are continuing with the trainings, and we are launching actually the second round of trainings in June, and continue through the full next year. And we're gonna have the trainings we already did again, but we're also gonna go a step further for people who did the first training already, so that they have a second training where they can go deeper. So basically, it's just taking the mental health first aid, splitting it properly over time for our people. And I guess it has to do with where we stand as a company, how much we already did on mental health, and how ready we are, and what kind of time we can invest ongoingly to actually upskill our people. That was just an approach we chose.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I hope, Eva, that was helpful for you, that answer. Otherwise, feel free to, okay, perfect, thumbs up. Thank you so much, Nicole. There is one last comment actually in the chat, which I would like to take. It's from Alice, and she says, and I think we can agree on that, Nicole, that there is always kind of a time lapse between when a company realizes there is a need versus when the leaders are actually start to act on it, right? And I think when we look at the fast pace of change and disruption in our world, I think we cannot waste the time. And I think we really have to make sure, and that's why it's great, Nicole, that you have the possibility at PwC to really implement that and continue that initiative to have this sustainable impact, because the teams nowadays, they need to adapt quite quickly for creative and innovative responses from, you know, the society, from their clients, from all different kinds of stakeholders. And for that, they really need to have an environment where they feel safe. So Alice, I agree, there is this time lapse. However, I think we have to make sure that it's not going to be too long, because I think at the end of the day, a lot of the companies, they just cannot afford to wait any longer. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, Nicole, if you would like to add something to that comment as well.
No, it's a super point Alice made, and I completely agree. I mean, in the end of the day, I think this is pure change management. And it needs time for people to change. And I think the important factor for us as people to make a change is actually that we feel like, okay, there is an urgency. We need to be personally affected in order so that we want to do a change. And therefore, there are different timelines for different people. Someone who is directly affected will have a fast change. Someone else just needs to experience it and kind of needs to have a mental shift in order to feel like it's necessary to have a change. Therefore, yeah, different timeline for a lot of different people. I completely agree.
Thank you, Nicole. And thanks, Alice, for the comment. We see that Anna actually raised her hand. Anna, feel free to unmute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I have a question, Patricia, to you about those quadrants that you explained earlier. I noticed that over the last years, we see a lot of not only companies actually, but even communities building up based on some key values. So to join any type of community, I don't know, from ski club to women diversity, you need to fall under 5 values that they define as a value-based community. And on one hand, okay, it's very high-level values like empathy or curiosity, so you can fall on them. But I always feel a certain resistance thinking, for me, it's not inclusion in the full sense, because I need to tick these 5 boxes. And if for me, curiosity, it's not in my top 5, but probably in top 10, and I have something else, then I don't fit this community. And I kind of wanted to hear your view on that, when the acceptance to a certain company or community is purely based on a set of values that somebody defined upfront.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Anna. I feel that it depends a little bit on what kind of values they define, right? Are they very narrow or are they kind of open-minded? Because obviously, I completely agree with you. If the values are super narrow, then you start to exclude people consciously, actually. And well, it's a question if you want to do that as a network, as an association, as a group. Maybe you do want to keep the group quite small, and therefore you don't want to include other people. And maybe that's the goal of your network and association, and that's fine, you know. But then you actually have to elaborate on that. Then you have to explain why you do that. It's something else if you actually want to have an inclusive group, if you want to have a diverse group where everybody can bring their uniqueness and their diverse perspectives in, and you want to actually benefit from that, then you cannot work with such narrow values. So I think at the end of the day, it's always a question of why are you defining values? That's the first question that you have to answer or be able to answer. And then like, what kind of values do you want to define? And then how do you actually implement that? And I just fear that some of the networks and associations, they just come up with values without actually having answered the questions, the first question, why are they doing that? Why are they having values? And what are their goals with this group, you know? So I feel that's something that has to be pointed out first. Otherwise, I agree, you can start to exclude people, can be hurtful, especially in a working environment. So maybe it's helpful for you that next time you see that, maybe you can go ahead and ask the people who are responsible why they are having such values and why it's important for them and how do they implement that. And maybe that gives you a hint also in the direction that maybe that group is not interesting for you. So, and if it's not being answered, maybe you can just raise this point and say, hey, maybe you're just excluding people and you're not even aware of that. A lot of the time it happens actually very unconsciously. And so therefore, maybe speaking up really helps. So I'm checking the time here. It's already past 11 and then we went over that hour, and I thank you for your patience and I thank you for your interactive participation. And of course, most of all, thank you so much, Nicole, for being with us today, for giving a lot of interesting insights in what you are doing at PwC, such an impactful, interesting, and very, very important work that you are doing. And it's very nice of you that you were able to share that with our community. And I hope a lot of you here in the audience were able to benefit and maybe use the potential that you already have in your companies to drive those initiatives forward and actually implement them quite sustainably. So from my side, thank you, Nicole.
Also a big thank you from my side. It was a pleasure to have this very interesting conversation with you, and also with the audience. Thank you for the very, very super questions you raised today.
Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again in other interesting D&I sessions that we are conducting at the Competence Center for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of St. Gallen. So stay tuned. If you haven't done that, subscribe for our newsletter. It would be a pleasure to see you again in one of the next sessions. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.